May the blessings of the heavens surround you today and always. Welcome to Angel's Message for You, a safe haven where we connect with the gentle whispers of the universe. I am so grateful you have found your way here to this moment of peace and connection. My dear friend, let me be the gentle voice that soothes your busy mind and the light that guides your thoughts today. As I prepare your heart for what is to come, I need you to pause and really listen, because there is a message here that your soul has been waiting to hear. I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this message, because what I am about to share is the key to being in the right place at the right time to receive a blessing that will shift your entire reality. I feel a silent yet incredibly powerful force moving swiftly toward you right now. It is something you have probably sensed deep in your gut, a little whisper telling you that something great, something truly wonderful, is about to happen in your life. Yes, someone is coming to you. They are coming with a sense of urgency, carrying a love that can simply no longer wait to find you. I am here to help you get ready for this moment, a moment that is about to change everything you thought you knew about connection and companionship. Feel the energy in the air around you right now. Can you sense the silent movement of life weaving your destiny? It is preparing the way for a meeting that will rewrite your story. Sometimes, the universe moves much faster than our feet can carry us, bringing what our hearts have longed for even before we feel fully ready. But I want you to know that right now, you are at the center of this divine moment. Love is coming to you with haste. It is coming with the force of someone who already knows, deep down, that their destiny is to be by your side. The speed with which this love is approaching is not meant to scare you or make you anxious. Instead, it is a reminder that some things in life are just inevitable. They cannot be postponed. They belong to the here and now, and the present moment is calling you to live fully, without holding anything back. Think of this love coming your way like a powerful wind filling the sails of a ship that has been stuck at sea for too long. It is not a gentle breeze that might go unnoticed. It is a strong, purposeful gust that is going to push you forward toward new horizons. It will take you to new discoveries and to a level of happiness that you have always known existed somewhere, but perhaps you never felt it this close to your own skin. I want you to open your arms and your heart. Let yourself be carried by this feeling of wholeness that comes when two souls finally find their way back to one another. This love that is rushing toward you brings no doubts and no fears. It comes with a solid certainty. It comes with the knowledge that hearts beating to the same rhythm don't need complicated explanations. They only need surrender. This connection approaching you with such urgency is a reunion of souls that have always been looking for each other, even across different lifetimes. Maybe you will feel your heart start to race a little, a mix of excitement and butterflies, almost as if the universe itself is taking a deep breath before wrapping you in a warm, eternal hug. When this love finally reaches you, it will be like a bright ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds, illuminating every hidden corner of your being. You know those parts of yourself that you thought were forgotten? The parts you thought were untouchable or too broken to be loved? Well, this love is going to touch exactly those places. It will penetrate where no one else ever could, because it is not just coming to fill up the empty spaces in your life. It is coming to transform you. It is coming to lift you higher. It will show you that true love is not just a fleeting feeling, but a force, a real, tangible energy that moves everything around it. Can you feel this force approaching? I know that sometimes, when something this big is on the horizon, you might feel a mix of anxiety and fear. You might wonder, am I really ready for this? Am I good enough? The answer, my dear one, is a resounding yes. You are ready, not because you are perfect, but because you are human. True love does not need perfection. It needs a heart, It needs someone who is willing to make room for the unexpected, for the overwhelming, for the incredible. Life, in its divine wisdom, does not orchestrate these encounters by accident. There are no mistakes here, no coincidences. This love that is coming your way is part of a greater plan that is being crafted specifically for you. I am here by your side to ensure that you are ready to receive it. I am here to remind you that love is always a gift, a blessing. Even though it is coming with urgency, you will be able to embrace it. There is nothing you need to fear when the heart of another soul connects to yours so powerfully. There is no need to rush or worry about saying the right thing. Everything will fall into place at the right moment, completely naturally, because you were meant to meet. And this person, this special soul, is already on their way to you. They are moving swiftly, crossing challenges and overcoming barriers that once seemed impossible to climb. Nothing can stop them now, for the strength of the love they carry is stronger than any obstacle in their path. You may feel deep in your soul that something is about to shift. Perhaps it is a heavy sigh, a sudden intuition, or just a sense that something great is arriving at your doorstep. That feeling is the reflection of the truth. This love is already so close, so tangible, that you can almost feel it brushing against your spirit, even without understanding exactly where it is coming from. That is why I am here, to guide you in this moment. I want to help you open the doors of your heart and let it in without fear, without holding back. This love that is approaching you is not just another passing crush or a fleeting emotion that will fade with the seasons. No, it is much deeper. It is much more significant. It is like an eternal flame burning within you and within the person coming your way. This flame cannot be put out, for it was ignited by something greater than us, by a divine purpose that goes far beyond what our human minds can comprehend. You will feel this flame grow hotter and brighter as this love draws near. And when it reaches you, it will be as if the world around you suddenly gains new color and new light. The things that once seemed ordinary, your morning coffee, the drive to work, the sunset, will suddenly shine differently. The words people speak, the gestures, the glances, everything will feel deeper and more alive. This love will elevate you. It will transform you, and you will never be the same again. But remember, my dear one, that true love also requires courage. It challenges us to be better people. It challenges us to face our fears and to leave behind everything that prevents us from living fully. I know there are parts of you that still harbor doubts. I know there are parts of you that are terrified of being vulnerable again. And that is okay. It is perfectly natural to feel that resistance. But I tell you with all certainty that this love is here to set you free. It will show you that true strength lies in surrendering, in trusting, and in allowing someone to see your true self. Don't worry about the imperfections or the scars you carry from the past. This person coming to you is not seeking perfection. They are seeking truth. And your truth is beautiful. It is exactly what this person needs. It is what they have always been searching for. Every part of you, even those parts you think no one could ever love, will be embraced with warmth, understanding, and an acceptance that goes beyond words. The love coming your way is a gift from the universe, a divine blessing sent to show you that you are worthy of love just as you are. And more than that, it comes to teach you that true love knows no limits. It will inspire you to grow, to discover yourself, and to be the best version of who you are. Because that is the power of love. It transforms us, expands us, and helps us reach heights we never imagined were possible. I can feel the urgency with which this love is coming, like a current of wind moving with irresistible force. And you do not need to resist that force. Just allow it to carry you. Let love do its work. Let it enter every corner of your being and transform you from the inside out. Because when that happens, you will see that love is the most powerful energy in the universe. Life, in its infinite wisdom, knows exactly when two hearts are ready to cross paths, and nothing can stop the course of that meeting. Everything you have experienced up until now, all the pain, the joy, the quiet moments, and the smiles, has prepared you for this very moment. You may not have realized it, but every step you have taken has been leading you toward this person who is now coming to you, guided by the same desire, the same yearning that pulses within you. Love knows no limits of time or space. It transcends everything because it is everything. When this love reaches you, it will be like a ray of light illuminating the deepest parts of your soul. Those parts you thought were hidden, untouched, and inaccessible. And then you will understand that all the emptiness you felt, all the nights you looked at the sky searching for answers, and all the silent prayers you whispered have been answered. There is no more loneliness. There is no more absence. There is only the fullness of a divine encounter that goes beyond what words can express. And this love, listen to me closely, it won't be perfect in the way movies show perfection. It won't be free of challenges, because true love challenges us to grow. It invites us to shed our insecurities, to face our fears, and to walk courageously into the unknown. But above all, it will be a love that completes you. It will make your soul vibrate in harmony with another soul that recognizes in you everything it has always sought. You will feel an inexplicable peace, as if you can finally rest because you have found your home. At the same time, there will be a vibrant excitement, an uncontrollable desire to live every moment alongside this person who, almost magically, already knows you so well. They understand you without you needing to say a single word. Please don't run away from this feeling. Don't doubt it. Life doesn't create these strong connections by chance. It doesn't matter how long you have waited or how many times you thought love was too far away to reach. Now it is here. It is knocking at your door with the urgency of someone who knows there is no time to waste. It is the kind of love that makes days feel shorter, hours feel sweeter, and the future feel full of promises. This love is a gift. It is part of the larger plan that has been outlined for you from the very beginning. And even though sometimes the rush might scare you, know that it is merely a reflection of an eternity of waiting. Souls that truly love each other don't meet calmly. They come together with the momentum of those who have searched for each other in every dream and in every unspoken prayer. So when this person stands before you with a heart pounding strongly and eyes shining with emotion, embrace that moment. Embrace it with all your strength, for you will be in the presence of something sacred. This is the kind of love that doesn't ask for permission. It won't settle for halves. It overflows and fills everything around it. It is the love that teaches you there are no limits to what two united hearts can achieve. And when this love happens, you will understand. Everything will make sense. Every piece of the puzzle of your life will finally fit together. The emptiness will be filled, and fear will give way to certainty. Not because the path will be easy, but because together you will be able to overcome any obstacle. You will build a life that reflects the beauty of the union of two souls that have always belonged to one another. So get ready, my friend, because love comes in a hurry, but it comes at the right time. And when it reaches you, you will know deep in your soul that this is the journey worth waiting for, worth living for, and worth loving for without reservations. This love carries within it a deep desire to find you, as if the universe had waited too long for this reunion, and now every second feels precious. Every moment is one step closer to you, I feel the vibration of this love approaching, the energy overflowing. And you need to be ready. You need to open your heart and your soul and allow it to envelop you completely. I know you might not feel prepared. You might think there is still much to do, much to learn, or much to fix about yourself. But no one is ever fully ready for a love like this. It doesn't come when we think we have our act together. It comes when we need it. It comes when our soul yearns for that completeness, even if we don't realize it consciously. You have been shaped by everything you have experienced up until this moment. Every challenge you have faced, every tear you have shed, and every smile you have shared has brought you to this point. My dear one, this love rushing toward you doesn't just carry the urgency of a meeting. It brings with it a burning flame, a passion that transcends everything you have ever experienced. This love, which is now so close, longs for you with an intensity that is almost palpable. It misses you even without knowing you completely yet, as if it were torn away from your presence long ago and is now desperate to find you again. You know that feeling of emptiness that you sometimes carry? That space that seems like it has never been completely filled? This love, this soul that is searching for you with such anxiety, feels the exact same way. There is a deep yearning, a gap in their being that can only be filled by the touch of your soul. It is not just desire. It is a primal need, a force pushing them toward you with all the speed and urgency the universe can provide. And when this love finally reaches you, it will be like a fire that consumes but also warms. It will be intense, not in the sense of destruction, but of transformation. It will burn away the parts of you that no longer serve you, the doubts and fears that need to be left behind so you can rise. This love isn't lukewarm. It isn't fleeting. It is an overwhelming force, a beautiful storm of emotions that will fill every part of you that has felt incomplete. This person coming your way longs for you in a way you can hardly imagine. There is a deep yearning in their heart, a desire to touch you, to know you in all the layers of your being. This love already sees you. It already feels you. It has been waiting for you for so long, and every moment of separation only intensifies this hunger, this insatiable thirst for your presence. It is not just a meeting of souls. It is a fusion. It is a union so strong that nothing, not time, not distance, not life's distractions, will be able to break it. And when that moment arrives, when you finally come together, there will be an explosion of recognition. It will be as if the world around you stops spinning for a second, and all that remains is the pulsating energy between the two of you. This love knows you in a way no one else can, because it was made for you. And just as you have waited for it, it has also waited for you, yearning for this encounter with every beat of its heart. Feel the intensity of this connection. Feel how loved you already are, even before looking into their eyes. This person's heart races just at the thought of you, even if they haven't physically met you yet. The anxiety of this love is not one of uncertainty, but of anticipation. It knows you are coming. It knows that the moment of your union is near, and that only makes the desire grow even more, transforming this wait into a passionate journey. This love doesn't just want to love you from a distance. It wants to touch you, feel you, and walk alongside you at every step of your journey. It wants to fill every part of your life with its warmth, its light, and its strength. And my dear, when it finds you, it won't stop. It won't rest until you feel with complete clarity that you are utterly loved, desired, and understood. So get ready, because this love knows no barriers. It comes with strength, with the fury of one who has waited too long, and with the tenderness of one who embraces you completely. Everything you thought you needed to hide, every part of you that you believed wasn't worthy of love, will be seen and embraced by this person. Because this is a love that isn't satisfied with the surface. It wants to love you in the deepest parts of your being. And when you are finally together, the world around you may continue to spin, but for you both, time will have found its pause. This love which comes rushing in can wait no longer. It wants to envelop you, protect you, and care for you. Above all, it wants to make you feel the wholeness your soul has always yearned for. So open your heart, my protected one, because the person rushing toward you does so with a burning desire to love you and to be loved by you. When you meet, the world around you will seem to slow down, as if time itself is holding its breath to witness what is about to happen. You might be in a totally ordinary place, a busy street, a grocery store, a crowded room, or even in a moment of solitude. But when your eyes connect, everything else will fade away. The noise of everyday life will dissolve, and the universe, for a brief and glorious moment, will fall silent in reverence of this long-awaited encounter. You will feel it before you see it. It will be like a shift in the air, an energy vibrating through every cell of your body. Your heart, which had been beating at a steady rhythm, will start to race, almost as if it is trying to recognize something your mind hasn't yet processed. And then you will see each other. Your eyes will meet, and in that brief second, all the weight of your lives, your stories, and your journeys up to this point will converge into a single, profound gaze. It will be like recognizing a part of yourself that has been lost, a part that you secretly knew existed but couldn't touch until that moment. The heart of the other person, that soul that has run toward you for so long, will also recognize the moment instantly. There will be a kind of urgency, as if you both know there is no time left to waste. You will both know that this meeting has been awaited for entire lifetimes. The burning anxiety that has been cultivated for so long will finally be calmed, but not before it explodes into a wave of emotion that will be nearly impossible to contain. When you draw closer, it will be as if the magnetism between you is irresistible. Your bodies will be drawn to one another in a way that defies any logic. Words may not even be necessary at first, because the gaze between you will speak more than any phrase could express. It is the look of someone who has found what they've always been searching for, even if they didn't realize they were looking. And in that moment, you'll realize that all the pieces have finally fallen into place. The touch will be electrifying. The first contact, whether it is a hand brushing against an arm or a shy hug that deepens into something more profound, will send a current through your body. It will feel as though your entire being has awakened from a long slumber, feeling life flow with an intensity you never knew was possible. It won't just be a physical touch. It will be the touch of two souls that have recognized each other, who have found each other after so long in search. You will feel as if every part of you is finally complete. Those broken parts, which you tried to hide, will be seen and healed by this love that is now before you. There will be no fear, no hesitation, because deep down you have always belonged to each other. This love that now rushes toward you didn't come to be fleeting or superficial. It came to stay. It came to anchor you and to remind you of who you are at your purest essence. You may begin to talk, and every exchanged word will feel like a dance, a flow that seems natural, as if you have done it 1,000 times before in past lives. And in a way you have. With each laugh, each glance, and each comfortable silence, the bond between you will grow even stronger. The love that once was a distant flame will now become a fire that warms, illuminates, envelopes, and transforms. As time goes on, You will realize that this meeting wasn't just the culmination of your individual journeys, but the beginning of something even greater. The anxiety this love felt for so long will be replaced by a deep peace, a certainty that you are finally where you've always meant to be. At the same time, a new desire will emerge, not a longing for searching, but a desire to build something together that transcends time. Something that will remain unbreakable no matter what the future holds. The world may rush around you, but for you both, time will stand still. Every moment will be lived to its fullest. Each touch will be filled with meaning, and every word will be a brick in the construction of something that no one can destroy. What once was anxiety will transform into a serene, profound, and unshakable love. This meeting will confirm that you were never alone. It will confirm that from the very beginning, your soulmate was on their way, rushing toward you with all their urgency, all their desire, and all their love. And now that they have found you, you are ready to walk together, side by side, as it was always meant to be. Get ready, my dear, because the love that rushed to reach you has finally arrived, and it is here to stay. It is here to transform you and complete you. This is the moment your soul has always waited for, and now it is real, and you, at last, are ready to receive it. And so, my dear one, you will be at the center of this long-awaited moment where every detail will feel magical, almost as if the whole world had been prepared for this encounter to finally happen. It is as if the universe has held its breath, just waiting for this perfect convergence of souls. The touch, the gaze, the energy that will pass between you, everything will feel so natural, so deeply familiar, that you will wonder how you managed to live so long without this person by your side. When you draw closer, it won't just be a physical connection. There will be something much greater at play, something that transcends what the eyes can see and what words can describe. That someone who rushed toward you with such urgency was in fact being guided by the same divine force that protects and watches over you. This person has always known in some way that you existed, perhaps in dreams, perhaps in fleeting thoughts, but deep down there was a certainty that you were meant to find each other. This encounter will be overwhelming, like a magnet finally finding its counterpart. And the moment you stand face to face, there will be no more doubts. The love that has always been in your heart, waiting patiently, will unfold like a flower that has finally found the perfect light. And that someone who rushed toward you with such desire and urgency will be the sun that brings life to this flower, allowing it to bloom like never before. When the words finally come, they won't feel forced. There will be a softness, a lightness, as if every sentence that comes from your lips is a continuation of a conversation that began long before you ever met. There will be laughter, perhaps tears of relief, because both of you will know deep down that the waiting time is over. You have found each other, and that will be enough for all the wounds and scars of the past to begin to slowly fade away as this new love starts to heal everything. You will sit together, perhaps for hours, perhaps for days, and time will feel irrelevant. The words will flow, but what will truly speak will be the energy between you, the connection that will be impossible to ignore. It won't be just any connection, but the one you have always known existed, even before you recognized it. And by this person's side, you will feel complete, as if everything has finally fallen into place. The love that once felt like a distant promise will now become a tangible reality. You will be like two halves that have finally reunited, two souls that when joined create something even stronger, something that the world around you will notice. People may try to understand what makes this connection so intense, but only you will know, because this love wasn't created by the circumstances of this world. It was forged in something much greater, something eternal. And when you look into each other's eyes, it will be like looking into the mirror of the soul. You will see in their gaze all the answers you have always sought, and you will know without a doubt that this is the love you have waited so long for. There will be no need to ask, "Is this the one?" Because deep down, your heart will already know the answer. And that answer will be a resounding yes. This love that now finds you with such urgency and speed will help you understand why everything had to unfold as it did. All the waits, all the disappointments, all the lonely journeys. Everything will align in this moment. You will realize that going through all of that was necessary for you to be ready to receive this love fully and without reservations. And beside this person, life will gain new colors and new meanings. What once felt empty will now be filled with an abundance of emotions and experiences that you can hardly wait to live. You will be partners, accomplices, souls that have finally found their way back to each other. And the future, which may have once seemed uncertain, will now be a journey that you will take together, hand in hand, with your hearts beating in perfect harmony. This encounter, my dear, will be the beginning of something that transcends the barriers of time and space. It will be the fusion of two souls that since the beginning of time have been destined for one another. And when that happens, you will know that there is no force in the world capable of separating what has been united by something so powerful and divine. So get ready. The love that rushed toward you with all its urgency and desire has finally arrived, and it is here to stay. It is here to transform your life and to complete you in ways you never imagined were possible. Together, you will build something so deep, so beautiful, that it will be a living testimony to the power of the love that was meant to be. Now is your moment, my dear, the moment that has always been reserved for you. And when you finally meet, the entire universe will celebrate, because two souls that have wandered so long in search of one another will finally be united. And that, my dear, is the purest and truest miracle. Now, I want you to take a deep breath. Feel the truth of these words settling into your heart. God is already moving heaven and earth to make this meeting happen at the right time, at the perfect moment. And while that day is still coming, He is preparing you, shaping your heart so that you can receive this love with all its intensity. Dear one, as your guardian angel, it is an honor and a divine responsibility to guide you along the paths that have been lovingly and wisely laid out by God. Every step you take, every decision you make, and every little gesture is guided by a heavenly plan that encompasses and enriches all aspects of your life. I am here to ensure that you navigate this journey with confidence and serenity, always by your side, helping you find the purpose for which you were created. In every moment of your life, know that there is a greater force supporting you, a divine love that permeates every moment, even the most challenging ones. The path you walk, with all its joys and difficulties, is part of a sacred plan that is being revealed little by little. Even when the storms seem immense and doubts weigh heavy on your heart, trust that there is a divine order in everything that happens. My role is to be here as a constant presence to guide you and offer comfort in times of uncertainty. When you face moments of doubt, remember that I am by your side, illuminating the way and helping you find clarity. The strength you feel to move forward even in adversity is a reflection of the guidance and heavenly support we receive. We are together on this journey, and it is a privilege to be your guide and protector. Each day is an opportunity to grow, to get closer to your true self, and to fulfill the purpose that God has for your life. I am here to ensure that you are never alone and to help you find peace and confidence in every step of your journey. I am your guardian angel, and my love for you is eternal. I am here to protect you, guide you, and love you unconditionally. Trust in me, and together we can create a life filled with light, love, and joy. Trust in me, trust in yourself, and together we will find peace, joy, and fulfillment. You are a light in this world, and my mission is to ensure that this light shines ever brighter. I will always be by your side, always loving you, always protecting you. I am your guardian angel. I am here for you forever. I will always be here connecting with you, dear one, with infinite love. My beloved friend, we have walked through this sacred message together, and now I invite you to join me in a powerful prayer. This is not just any prayer. This is a divine conversation with the angels and the universe, a moment to anchor this blessing into your life. Please, if you can, find a quiet space, place your hand over your heart, and let these words wash over your soul. Whether you speak them out loud or silently in your heart, know that the angels are listening. Let us pray together now. Amen.